Hi, welcome to Tasha's Library. Today's video is going to be looking at 5 books that have impacted me significantly in my life. And they comprise of 1 sci-fi, 2 fantasy, and 2 classics. And I've decided to have a look at them in the order that I've read them. So going back to when I was younger to the most recent that I have read. And I've selected these books not because they necessarily mean some of them are my favorites, some of them aren't. They're just books that really impacted me at the time, made me think in different ways, showed me what books could be, immersed me in reading. The first book I'm going to be looking at is my all-time favorite book. It's Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I had to choose this. What can I say? It is the ultimate epic fantasy. I probably don't have to give a lot of information about it. You all know what it's about. But the characters and the world building and the epic adventure and quest and the friendships and the camaraderie, and it's just incredible. And I adore it. I've read it several times. And I've watched the movies, and it will continue to be my favorite novel. It has always stood the test of time to me. I was not put off by Tom Bombadil, unlike others. I actually found him quite interesting and was a little bit disappointed he wasn't in the films, actually. But I think that's an unpopular opinion. So why did this affect me? Well, I read it when I was probably about 12, 13, and this is the book that really got me into fantasy. It showed me that books can take me into a completely different world that's not my own. And I had, of course, always been an immersive reader. I had always felt that I was living someone else's life, but this was just a whole new world. And it was the first book I read where I actually felt sad when I finished it, and I felt lost. I did not know what else to read because I remember thinking nothing can ever be this good again. The second book is I was probably read it around the same time, so I can't quite remember which came first, but it's The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley. Now, this is a classic. It's probably not as well known as some of the others I'm obviously going to talk about. And it was just really interesting because when I was in primary school, I think this was my last year of primary school, basically our classrooms had book boxes, and during reading time, we would go in and pick a book that we could then borrow for the week, and would read it in reading time and then take it home and finish it. And it was just a great way to encourage reading. And so I remember looking through this book box, and I was going to pick one book, and my teacher came to me and said, no, you know what? I think you can do something a bit more advanced. And so she handed me this book, and it was The Go-Between. And wow, it blew my mind. Now, I don't even remember the whole plot. I just remember how I felt when I read it. I was captivated. Now, if you don't know what this book is about, it's told from the point of view of this young schoolboy, Leo, who is from a middle-class family. He's been sent to a boarding school, doesn't quite fit in because he's slightly lower class than some of the other boys. But he does make a friend, and he's invited to spend summer with his friend Marcus in his little family estate. And so it's really interesting because then he gets there. He doesn't still feel like he really belongs in this family, in this setting. It's all a bit too posh for him. But what happens is he's convinced by Marcus's sister, Marion, to become this go-between, delivering letters between her and her forbidden love, who is a farmer. And he kind of feels obliged to do this because he isn't of the same class. And it was just really interesting. Obviously, like, crazy stuff happens. What's fascinating about the book is that he reconstructs the events from diaries that he's found of himself at the time. And so he's not quite remembering what happened. He knows that something traumatic happened, but he sort of doesn't have any recollection. So he's trying to piece together the clues from his diary. And it's just incredible because you've got this unreliable narrator, and you're starting to get hints at things that are happening that the schoolboy couldn't understand. And so it's multi-layered. It explores all these themes such as coming of age and hierarchies and social rules and, love and sex and fate. And that's what blew my mind about this book. It was the very first book I'd ever read that I felt explored big ideas. That it wasn't just looking at quests or cool adventures or, cute animals talking or, all my childhood books. This was a big person book, a book that explored these massive ideas, and it made me think like no other book has. It made me feel emotions that other books hadn't, and it showed me that books can have these multiple layers of meaning. The third book I'm going to talk about today is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which is really just a novel of manners published in 1813. It follows this family of 5 girls, and their mother is desperate for them to get married because the inheritance in the family means that the house is going to be passed on to their cousin when their father dies, and then they will be left penniless, homeless, unless they are married and find other fortunes. And of course, they're the days when women really only find a fortune by being married. It's this group of sisters trying to navigate balls and this whole high-class society, trying to meet all these men. And it really doesn't sound like something I'd like normally, because I don't like romance. I don't like all these historical fiction. I don't like family dramas. But what's amazing about this book is its satire. It is so funny because it really questions the values and of the time. It explores those themes of inheritance and marriage and class and reputation. And wow, it was something different at the time. I would have been in my early teens, and it was the very first book that I stayed up all night reading. And I mean all night. I started reading it in the evening and I stayed up till dawn finishing this book. And this to me was groundbreaking, and it made me realize how much books mean to me and how much a book can engage me to such an extent that I will forgo sleep. And I tell you, I love my sleep. So this was incredible, and it still remains one of my all-time favorite books. I have subsequently read all of Jane Austen's books, but Pride and Prejudice is just up there. It will always be up there just because of the experience and the memory it invokes of my being so engrossed and finding this book so funny and so interesting. The fourth book I'm going to look at is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And I actually came into this a little bit late. So I would have read it once the first 2-3 books were out. I was in my early 20s and I'd heard all this hype. I was in that stage of my life where I was too cool for hyped things, and I avoided it. And eventually I picked it up, and this book brought me into modern fantasy. I remembered loving Lord of the Rings. I'd read a few other fantasies, but I'd never found anything that captivated me like Lord of the Rings. And so Harry Potter showed me that there were other books that I could immerse myself in the same way, with the same world building. I mean, not the same world building, but being able to create this whole new world to me. That, that magic school setting, the creatures, it was just incredible. And I had the great experience then of awaiting the sequels, and then, reading them in like one day. And since then I have reread the whole series multiple times, and I still really love it. It hasn't stood the test of time in the way that Lord of the Rings has, but because of its impacts in bringing me to modern fantasy, it will remain one of my favorites of all time. And the final book I'm going to talk about is Dune by Frank Herbert. This, I have to admit, I only read at the beginning of this year. I hadn't really been into sci-fi. I delved into it slightly over the years, but I always found it wasn't my cup of tea, which is kind of weird because I love reading actual nonfiction science. But sci-fi just didn't captivate me like fantasy had. And last year was a major reading slump for me. I've always been an avid reader. I read every single night my whole life since I've learned how to read. And even when I was full-time studying and working and then studying part-time, I always managed to read at least one novel a week on top of everything else. And last year, however, I just couldn't motivate myself. I think it was just the whole lockdown stuff, all the COVID stuff. It just got me down. I'd moved to a new town where I didn't know anyone, was on my own, and you'd think that'd be great for reading, but my mental health was just not conducive to concentration. So Dune, however, I picked up because I went to Canberra just for Christmas shopping trip. And I was looking through bookshops, feeling pretty miserable and very sorry for myself, really. And I decided I was going to treat myself to some books. And I decided to just go all out and try something different. And I picked up Dune. Put it aside. January, picked it up. And I read it in a couple of days, as I said. And this book got me into reading again. And more than that, it actually enthused me and motivated me to actually read more sci-fi. And since then, I have read so much sci-fi and I feel like, oh my God, I've been missing out. Because the couple sci-fis I'd read in the past weren't my type of book, doesn't mean there aren't so many other books that are just amazing. And I have loved it. And it's kind of reminded me why I loved fantasy as well, because it reminded me of that world building and that complete escape. Because prior to that, I had been reading a lot of crime fiction, and I just think that was too much for me. And it reminded me, it gave me that feeling again that I had when I read Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, and it was just like, oh, I'm home now. This is my cozy place. And even though it was quite dark in places, it was like I'd returned home. And since then I've had one of the best reading years of my life this year. I've picked up a number of different fantasy and sci-fi books that I had missed out on, really, because I hadn't been reading them for so long. So I owe it all to Dune. And for that, even though it wasn't one of my favorite books, I probably won't read it again, but I have to really be grateful for what it did for me. That's it. 5 books that impacted me. I'm sure I could have thought of heaps more. Those are the 5 that really stuck out to me. So thank you for watching, and may the books be with you.